Hey there, guys. Alright, today we are back with some more of the Great War. This time on to week 87. We're nearing week 100. Almost there. We're almost to the halfway point, kinda, sorta. A Russian spring offensive. Confusion at Fort Vaux. Before we dive in, though, make sure you go and check out the links in the description box below. I would love it if you joined the Discord and followed me over at Twitch. My hair is a mess today. So, let's go ahead and dive right in.
Both Russia and Italy had promised the French they would mount new offensives to try and relieve some of the pressure of the ongoing Battle of Verdun.
Yes, because as we know, the Allies are amazing at holding to their promises. Just ask, those living in the Middle East. Really great. Sykes-Picot Agreement. So wonderful. Such a genius idea.
Last week, the Italians had launched one on the Isonzo River, and this week, in colossal numbers, the Russians strike.
Gasp.
I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to the Great War.
I'm
Last
Ryan.
week on the Italian front saw the Fifth Battle of the Isonzo River. The Western Front was still all about Verdun. Dutch shipping was being sunk at sea, and a prison rescue went down in Libya. Here's what came next. We didn't look too much at Verdun last week, so I'll start there. Last week I mentioned that the Germans had been repeatedly thwarted in their attempts to capture Fort Vaux. Fort Vaux stood on the right bank of the Meuse River. Now, the village of Vaux changed hands 13 times during March, but the fort never fell to the Germans. At one point, the German commander, Lieutenant General Goretzky-Kornitz, got word that the fort had in fact fallen. He passed the news on to command, where it went out worldwide. The Kaiser awarded him the Pour le Mérite, but when his men went to the fort, they were all shot down. And French Commander-in-Chief Joseph Joffre issued an order of the day to the defenders. You will be those of whom it is said, they barred the way to Verdun. On March 20th, came a German attack at the edge of the Verdun salient, near Vaucourt. It was the 11th Bavarian Division, led by General Paul Ritter von Knoissel, who had won his own Pour le Mérite for recapturing the fortress of Przemyśl last year. Initially, at Vaucourt, many of his men were buried alive when the French blew in their front line. But the French frontline troops had been on the lines for too long and had lost hope. Many deserted, and they gave the Germans details of how to pass the French barbed wire. It then took just 4 hours for the Germans to capture the French positions and force surrender. 2,825 men, 25 machine guns, and a box full of the Croix de Guerre medals ready for distribution. This was a big blow to French high command, but it served to rouse the French defenses. 2 days later, when the Germans tried to capitalize on their successes, they were slaughtered from 3 sides by French machine guns.
Damn.
Rain had pretty much turned the battlefield into a swamp, and the Germans could not bring up mortars to handle the machine guns. They lost 2,400 men that day and gained 0 ground. Verdun is a fairly small area, and this week, France's ally Russia attacked in a far larger one. On the 18th, the Russians launched an offensive just south of Dvinsk, a marshy lake area. The German lines ran from Lake Drizviati to Postavi, and another Russian attack developed further south on the banks of Lake Narok. But the Russians were thrown back with 9,000 men killed in just 2 days. The night of March 20th, between Postavi and Veleti, the Russians gained a foothold in the German trenches, and in order to throw back a strong German counterattack, a curtain of fire was laid before the trenches. At the same time, German artillery strongly supported the attack of their infantry. On both sides, the gunfire became so violent that single shots could not be distinguished any longer. Shrapnel exploded without cessation, and rifle fire became so rapid that it sounded hardly less loudly than big gunfire. Late in the afternoon, the Germans succeeded in retaking the trenches.
Oof.
There were, in fact, Russian attacks from Riga down to the Romanian border this week, with incredible violence and energy, and the Russian losses were immense. One correspondent wrote, "They have about 60 divisions ready. Their losses are in proportion and were estimated on a front of about 90 miles to have been near to 80,000 men.
Oh.
For instance, against one German cavalry brigade, there were thrown 7 regiments with a very narrow front, but 8 lines deep. 4 times they came rushing against the German barbed wire without being able to break through, but losing some 3,000 men just the same. But why do you suppose the Russians were attacking like crazy, especially in the far north at Dvinsk and Lake Narok? And let's be clear, fresh troops were arriving daily, and the Russian munitions supply network, which had, so far in the war, been one of the main reasons for Russian failures and disasters, was suddenly inexhaustible, and the attacks were now all pretty carefully prepared. What was going on here? I'll tell you what. Spring was coming, and with it, the thawing of the snows and the coming of the floods. And along almost the entire northern front, the Germans had a big advantage coming. Their positions were on higher and drier ground than the Russian ones, and the Russian trenches, once the thaws and floods came, would be unusable. So you can see that the enormous energy the Russians suddenly had, and the total disregard for life which their commanders had in these March offensives, were mainly because of the need to get their men to better ground before it was too late. And some will argue that from a tactical point of view, the losses they were taking, the price they seemed willing to pay, was not too great for the hope for reward. So the attacks in just what is now Belarus featured 350,000 troops and over 1,000 big guns. There was a lot of action in the north this week, and some of it was in the North Sea, where a naval battle took place March 24th. The German auxiliary ship Greif took on the British converted merchant ship Alcantara. The Greif was trying to run the British blockade under Norwegian colors when she was hailed. The Alcantara came within a few hundred meters and put a boat out. Seeing this, the Germans unmasked their guns and the battle began. In just 12 minutes, the Greif was on fire and the Alcantara was sinking from a torpedo explosion. Still, the Greif probably would have gotten away, but two other British ships arrived and the Greif was hit again. 115 men out of 300 on the Greif were saved. The British lost 74 men. Both ships sank to the bottom of the sea. Here's another marine note for the week. On March 22nd, the British tried out their new weapon, the depth charge, destroying a German sub off the coast of Ireland. And Ireland itself was restless this week. On the 21st at Tullamore, a loyalist crowd was demonstrating opposite Sinn Féin premises.
Oh yeah, we're halfway through. No, we're not halfway through. We're like a third of the way through 1915. Yeah, the Easter Rising shit's gonna start building up for 1916 soon.
In William Street, Sinn Féin being Irish Republicans working for an independent Ireland. There was a scuffle between the British loyalists and Sinn Féin volunteers, but when the police arrived and appeared to be protecting the Sinn Féin guys, people began throwing stones at the building and shots were fired from within. The police went in to search the premises, and the Sinn Féiners not only refused to be searched, they opened fire on the police, wounding 2 officers. Tensions were seriously growing in Ireland. And here are some notes to round out the week. On the 18th and 20th, the Allies bombed Zeebrugge. In East Africa, the British drove the enemy from the Ruwu River on the 18th and occupied...
What was that name? The Woo?
Occupied Arusha in Kilimanjaro the 21st. And here's a random quote I thought worth sharing about the Allied forces at Salonika in Greece. I spoke a while ago that malaria was endemic to the Salonika region, but it was winter now, and a British doctor wrote to the chief British medical officer at Salonika, "You still have about 2 months' grace before general malaria comes into the field." And another week comes to an end. A battle at sea, unrest in Ireland, the advent of the depth charge, ever more death at Verdun, and the Russians recklessly throwing hundreds of thousands of men at enemy lines all along the Eastern Front. The number of casualties, especially Russian casualties, on the Eastern Front truly boggled the mind. To think that human life was valued so cheaply. But Russia had 2 great advantages, land and men, and it would be foolish not to use them. The Western Front numbers are most often smaller, but still, and I'm not giving too much away, the Kaiser's biographer, Alan Palmer, wrote of Verdun, ultimately, on this one sector of the Western Front, the Germans suffered 1/3 casualties in occupying a cratered wasteland half the size of metropolitan Berlin. I think the concentration of death on a scale so large, but in an area so small, may well be the most grotesque and shocking thing about the whole war. All too often, these numbers make
And that was the Russian Spring Offensive. Confusion at Fort Vaux. The Great War, Week 87. There wasn't much to really say this week. Move my chair more center. There we go. Really wasn't much to say, but even though there was a lot happening, wasn't much to really comment on. But yeah, still an entertaining episode. I hope you guys enjoyed. Remember to hit that like button and subscribe for more, and I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.